Chapter 26. There was a strange, almost unworldly aroma tugging at her senses as Mara drifted towards consciousness. Something strange, yet vaguely pleasant. Good morning, Luke's voice came through the haze. With a jolt, Mara came fully awake, and in that first disorienting moment wished she hadn't. Even as she opened her eyes to the dimly lit gloom around her, she suddenly became aware of 100 sparks of pain jabbing through her muscles from her heels through her legs and back, right to the nape of her neck. Ow, she grunted under her breath. Luke's face appeared overhead, looking down at her with concern. Is your shoulder still hurting? He asked. Mara frowned, blinking away a little more of the haze clouding her mind. Right, her badly burned shoulder. Craning her neck down, focusing eyes that still weren't entirely awake, she peered down at her charred jumpsuit. And the smooth, unmarked skin showing through the hole there. No, she said, not quite believing it. The shoulder feels just fine. It's. Oh, right, your healing trance. Some disorientation is normal when you first come out of it, Luke assured her. Don't worry. I wasn't. She eased her shoulders around, trying to ignore the extra wave of tingles the movement sent running through her back. Luke's hand was there, gripping her arm and helping her sit up. You said it was morning? Well, afternoon, actually, Luke amended. But Han once told me that any time you woke up was technically morning. That sounds like his casual slant on things, Mara said. How long, in real time, have I been lying there? About 5 days, Luke told her. Easy now. Oh, you bet, she agreed, wincing as muscles that had been laid on for 5 straight days continued to complain loudly about their mistreatment. I'm impressed. I don't think even a Bacta tank would have done the job that fast. You have a strong force gift, Luke said, his hand hovering ready by her arm. That usually helps the healing process. It's definitely one I'm going to have to learn, she decided, looking around. That aroma she thought she dreamed was still there. It's some kind of roast avian, Luke explained, nodding towards the back of the landing. A wake-up gift to you from the Quam Jaw. Really, Mara said, hoisting herself carefully to her feet and hobbling over there on unsteady legs. It was a roast avian, all right, simmering on a cooking pad. Awfully nice of them. Where did you get the cooker? I sent Keeper of Promises back to your defender for the rest of the survival gear, Luke explained. I'd rather have sent them back to my X-Wing. The spare kit card put together was a lot more complete, but after our brush with the Threateners, they're not all that eager to go roaming around outside. This from the species that eats fire creepers raw? Mara pointed out as she eased back into a sitting position by the cooking pad. Pretty selective skittishness. It's a little more complicated than that, Luke said, seating himself cross-legged on the floor, across the cooking pad from her and gesturing towards the food. Hence the gift, actually. They've come to the conclusion that you saved their lives in there. I don't know how they figure that, Mara grunted, tearing off a piece of the roast. We were the ones being shot at, not them. Luke's lips puckered. Actually, there's some question about that. Splitter of Stones thinks it was the Quam Jaw who the Threateners were firing at, not us, at least until you started shooting back. And as I've gone back through my memories of the battle, I think he's right. Mara took a careful bite. The meat was a little overcooked for her taste, but not bad for all that. Anyway, as her loudly growling stomach reminded her, a person who hadn't eaten in 5 days couldn't afford to be too choosy. Interesting thought, she said, but I'm not sure where it gets us. Whoever they were shooting at, the fact is, they're still touchy about strangers. Maybe, Luke said, his tone odd. But maybe not. Haven't you wondered why the Threateners never came into the cave looking for you after you knocked yourself out? Are you sure they didn't come in? Mara countered around a mouthful of food. The Quam Jaw say they didn't, Luke told her. There were a couple of flybys with their ships, and that was it. In fact, as far as Child of Winds knows, they never even conducted an outside ground search of the area. Mara chewed thoughtfully, resisting the urge to point out that Child of Winds was not exactly the most reliable source of information around. Okay, she said. Let's assume the threateners lost interest in me. Where does that get us? If they simply lost interest, I don't know, Luke said. But what if they didn't lose interest, but just decided to wait until you found your own way into the High Fortress? Mara took another bite. That was a disturbing thought. In fact, it was an extremely disturbing thought. All the more so since that exact course of action was one she had actually considered early in her captivity. I don't know if Card mentioned it to you, she said slowly, but the way we found the system was by tracking the escape vectors from two of their ships to an intersect point. My assumption has always been that they simply didn't know we could track their vector for a few microseconds after they jumped to light speed. But now I'm not so sure. You think they wanted you to come here? It would fit with them not searching all that hard for me after I landed, Mira pointed out. Of course, if we argue that direction, we then have to come up with an explanation as to why they tried to shoot you down. Maybe they're not interested in having more than one guest at a time, Luke suggested, gazing off into space. Or maybe they don't want to talk to anyone from the New Republic until they've talked to you first. Mira eyed him closely. There had been a flicker in his emotions just then. Is that just off the top of your head, she asked, or are you getting something from the Force about it? He shook his head, still gazing at nothing. I'm not sure, he admitted, but I have the feeling. No, never mind. No, never mind what? Mara demanded suspiciously, pressing at the corners of his mind. Come on, we don't have time for games. A muscle in his cheek twitched. I get the feeling it's you they want to see, he said. You specifically. Mara lifted her eyebrows. I'm flattered. My fame just continues to spread. Eater of Fire Creepers did say they'd heard the Threateners talking about you, Luke reminded her. I wish we knew the exact context of the conversation. There was a flapping from the stairway, and one of the Quam Jaw appeared. It spoke. Thank you, Flyer Through Spikes, Luke said. Go see if Keeper of Promises has any news, if you would. The Quam Jaw replied, and with a flurry of wings was gone down the stairway. I've had some of the Quam Jaw patrolling the upper areas of the stairway and listening for activity outside the doors, Luke explained. Flyer Through Spikes tells me the upper areas of the fortress were active for a while this morning, but they seem to be quiet again. Ah, Mara said, tearing off another bite with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. Those blasted Quam Jaw and their blasted unintelligible voices. Something wrong? Luke asked. Mara glared at him. You know, Skywalker, it's really hard to keep any thoughts to yourself when you're around. He gave her an innocent look that had far too much amusement in it for her taste. Odd. I seem to remember a situation not too long ago when you couldn't wait to unload some of those choicer thoughts on me. Mara grimaced. Feeling a little more cheerful about our past mistakes this morning, are we? He sobered. Not cheerful, no, he said. Just learning how to acknowledge them, learn from them, and then pick up and move on. I've had a lot of time for thinking during these past 5 days, you know. You reach any particular conclusions? He looked straight at her. I know why you didn't turn to the dark side, he said, and why you keep coming up against limits on what you can do with the Force. With a casualness she didn't especially feel, Mara took another bite and settled her back against the stone wall behind her. I'm listening. The essence of the dark side is selfishness, Luke said. The elevation of yourself and your own desires above everything else. Mara nodded. Fairly obvious so far. The point is that all the time you were serving the Emperor, you were never doing it out of selfish motives, Luke said. You were serving, even if it was Palpatine and his own selfish ends, and service to others is the essence of being a Jedi. Mara thought about that. No, she said, shaking her head. No, I don't like it. Service to evil is still evil. What you're saying is that doing something wrong isn't really wrong if your motives are good. That's nonsense. I agree, Luke said, but that's not what I'm saying. Some of the things you did were certainly wrong, but because you weren't doing them for your own purposes, the acts themselves didn't open you to the dark side. Mara glowered at her food. I see the difference, she said, but I still don't like it. Actually, it's not that much different from the situation with the Gensari that Corin and I ran into on Susevi, Luke said. They didn't know how to be Jedi, but were still serving the best they knew how. And in the process had gotten themselves so bent around that you were years untwisting them, Mara reminded him tautly. Anyway, they at least had the memory of a role model to follow, didn't they? That what's his name Jedi? Nikos Tyrus, Luke said, nodding. Which brings up an even more interesting thought. Maybe you had a role model too. Mara shook her head. Not a chance. There wasn't a single person in the inner court with a scrap of what I'd consider virtue or morality. Then maybe it was someone in your life before you were taken to Coruscant, Luke suggested. Your parents, or some close friend. Mara bit off the last bite of her meal and tossed the carcass back into a corner. This is a dead-end conversation, she declared firmly, wiping her hands off her jumpsuit legs where the oils and grime would eventually flake off. Let's get back to the job at hand. Where did you stash my blaster? Luke didn't move. I know you don't remember much about your past, he said quietly. For whatever it's worth, I understand how you feel. Thanks, Mara growled. That certainly helps. Would you like to have that past back again? She frowned at him, conflicting emotions surging suddenly against each other. What do you mean? She asked cautiously. There are techniques Jedi can use to pull out buried memories, he said. And you could be a Jedi, Mara. You could be a powerful Jedi. Right, Mara bit out. All I have to do is declare I'm ready to serve the galaxy, right? Luke's forehead creased, and she caught the flicker of puzzlement from him. What is it about that scares you? He asked. You've served and worked with people all your life. Palpatine, Card, Leia, and Han and me. And once you've offered your loyalty, it's for keeps. You can do this. I know you can. Mara squeezed her hand into a fist, half-minded to close the subject again, and this time make sure she sat on the lid. But deep inside, she knew he deserved an answer on this one. I can't just offer that kind of blank-line invitation, she said. Sure, I can be loyal, but only to the people I choose to be loyal to. I'm not ready to open myself up to anyone who walks in off the street. She grimaced. Besides, I keep remembering stories about how the last step to becoming a Jedi is usually making some supreme and rather ugly personal sacrifice. I'm not crazy about that one either. It's not always as bad as it seems, Luke said, and Mara could sense his discomfort as unpleasant memories of his own floated back to the surface. Just before he died, Master Yoda told me that before I would truly be a Jedi, I needed to face Vader again. I jumped to the conclusion that meant that I had to either kill him or let him kill me. As it turned out, it didn't happen either way. But you had to be willing to make that sacrifice if necessary, Mara pointed out. Thanks, but I'm not interested. Then you automatically limit your capabilities, Luke said. If you aren't willing to make a commitment. Commitment, Mara snorted. You're the one telling me about commitment? What about Callista, or Gariel, or any of the other women you brushed paths with over the past 10 years? Where's been the commitment there? Luke's flash of anger was so sudden and so unexpected it physically shocked her back against the stone wall. You should talk, he snapped. What about Lando, huh? For a long moment they just glared at each other. Mara held her breath, bracing herself for another outburst, stories of uncontrolled Jedi anger running ominously through her head. But instead, she felt his anger drain away, replaced by shame and a deep embarrassment. I'm sorry, he said, dropping his eyes away from her face. That was uncalled for. No, I'm the one who should apologize, Mara said, trying to hide her own guilt feelings from him and knowing she was being only partly successful. She knew better than to fight like that. I know how you felt about those women and what happened to them. I'm sorry. That's all right, Luke murmured. What happened to them was probably partly my fault. Maybe even mostly my fault. I'm the one who dabbled in the dark side, not them. You acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them, Mara reminded him. Then you pick up and move on. It's time to pick up and move on. I suppose. Still not looking at her, he climbed to his feet. You're right. We should get moving. I had the Quam Jaw make some measurements while you were sleeping, and it looks like the upper door out of here should let us out in one of the top 3 floors of the fortress. Let's try that approach. Just a second, Mara said, looking up at him. She had promised herself, rather cavalierly, she realized in retrospect, that she wasn't going to tell him this until he point-blank asked her about it. But her silence was childish. Anyway, the accusation he'd just thrown in her face was probably close enough. You wanted to know about Lando and me, right? She saw the twitch at his neck. That's all right, he said. It's really none of my business. I'm making it your business, Mara said, getting to her feet so she could look him straight in the eye. What was between Lando and me was absolutely nothing. His eyes flicked suspiciously to hers. What do you mean? I mean just what I said. Absolutely nothing, she repeated. Card had an important mission for me to carry out, and because Lando had supplied the starting point, he invited himself along. The, well, personal aspects to the whole thing were nothing but window dressing to keep people from figuring out what we were up to. She could feel Luke probing at the edges of her mind. You could have told me, he said, not quite accusingly. You could have asked me, she countered. You never seemed all that interested. He grimaced, and she could feel a fresh wave of embarrassment wash over him. I didn't, did I? He admitted. You learn and move on, Mara reminded him. Actually, if you want to come right down to it, you were the one who got the whole thing started in the first place. Remember that beacon call you found on Dagobah and took to Lando's place on Niklan? Luke looked at her sharply. Yes. In fact, I was just thinking about it a few days ago. I wondered why it had suddenly come to mind. Proddings of the Force, no doubt, Mara said. It was as good an answer as any. It turns out that particular beacon call used to belong to someone Card once knew, who had dropped out of sight some years back. Fellow named George Cardass. Ever hear of him? Luke shook his head. No. Apparently not a lot of people have, she said. Made things so much more challenging. Anyway, with the beacon call we had a starting point, and Card asked me to try to track him down. And as I said, Lando, smelling profit no doubt, insisted on tagging along. Must have been a long search, Luke murmured. The stories of you and Lando. It took some years, Mara said. Off and on work, of course. She lifted her eyebrows. For whatever it's worth, the romance part of the cover story drove me crazy. But finding Cardass was important to Card, so I stuck with it. Like you said, loyalty. She hissed gently between her teeth with the memories. Though it did prove exceptionally embarrassing at times. There was one particular week on Mahali where Lando was trying to sugar-talk the Vice Baron Sukarian out of some information we needed. I had to become a giddy, vacant-brained bit of decorative fluff, because Sukarian automatically put that class of woman beneath his contempt, and the role gave me the freedom of movement I needed. The worst part was that Solo caught me in the act with a comm relay when I thought it was Sukarian calling. I'd never quite had the nerve to ask him what he thought of that. I don't think it would have ruined his opinion of you, Luke said, his voice an odd mixture of support, gallantry, and lingering embarrassment. Though I imagine Sukarian's opinion is probably beyond repair at this point. Oh, I don't think so, Mara assured him. I usually wore one of Lando's shirts during Sukarian's late-night visits and comm calls, and I made sure to leave one of them hanging on the open door of his private office safe. After I'd gutted it. Luke smiled. A tentative, still somewhat shamefaced smile, but a genuine smile nonetheless. At this point, that was enough. His reaction must have been interesting. Mara nodded. I like to think so. Yes. Luke took a deep breath, and she could sense him forcing old memories and extraneous thoughts to the back of his mind. But as you said, we've got a job to do, he said briskly. and it's going to be a long climb. Let's pack up the gear and get going." It was, as Luke had estimated from the numbers the Quam-Jaw had gathered for him, indeed a long climb. Nearly as long as it had been from the bottom of the hidden stairway to that first door, in fact. And with Mara's muscles still recovering from 5 days of idleness, and Luke himself therefore handling R2 and all the rest of the equipment, it should have been something of a strain. But to his mild astonishment, it wasn't, and it didn't take any deep Jedi insight to understand why. The barrier he had set up between him and Mara was gone. The odd part was that he hadn't even realized there had been a barrier there. The communication they had together, their ability to sense each other's thoughts and emotions, had been so close that he'd simply assumed that it was as strong as it got. He'd been wrong. He'd been very wrong. It was an exhilarating experience, and yet at the same time, a somewhat intimidating one as well. He'd experienced close mind contact with other people on occasion, but never to the same level as he was experiencing now. Mara's thoughts and emotions seemed to flow over him, their level and intensity now seemingly limited only by her personal barriers, as his own thoughts and emotions flowed the other direction back to her. There was a new rapport between them, a deepening of their old relationship that he only now realized how sorely he'd missed. Confession, apology, and forgiveness, Aunt Beru had been fond of reminding him, were the tools friends used to break walls down into bridges. Seldom, if ever, in his life had he had that truth so graphically demonstrated. With concern for Mara's physical condition and stamina foremost in his mind, he made sure the party took frequent rest breaks as they climbed, a policy that drove Mara just slightly less crazy than it did the Quam-Jaw. But he insisted, and as a result it took them nearly an hour to reach their target door. But when they did, at least, Mara was fully ready to go. "All right, here's the plan," Luke told her, stretching out with the force. As near as he could tell, the entire area outside the hidden door was clear. "We'll leave R2 and the Quam-Jaw in here and do a little reconnoiter of our own." "Sounds good." Mara pulled out her blaster and checked it, and Luke could sense her working to control her private misgivings about going back in there. Understandable, of course. She was the one who'd gotten shot. Luke had had something of the same trouble the first time he'd gone back to visit Cloud City. "How about leaving one of our comlinks here with them?" "Good idea," Luke agreed, pulling his comlink from his belt and putting it in R2's light-duty grasping arm. "Don't forget and turn it off," he admonished the droid. R2 warbled indignantly, the translation scrolling across the datapad. "Yes, I know," Luke assured him. "I was just kidding." "What?" Mara asked. "He said turning off comlinks at critical moments was 3PO's trick," Luke told her. "Private joke. You ready?" He could sense her reaching out to the Force for calm. "Ready," she said. "Let's do it." The secret door, gratifyingly enough, opened as quietly as the other one had. With Luke in the lead, they stepped out, closing the door behind them. "Now this," Mara said quietly in his ear, "is like the Hijarna fortress." Luke nodded acknowledgement, looking around. They were in a vast chamber with short wall segments scattered around apparently at random, linking the floor with a relatively low ceiling. The shiny wall coverings, elaborate flooring, and the wall sconces they'd seen below were absent, leaving nothing but unadorned and unrelieved black stone. Despite that, though, the place seemed oddly airy. "Doesn't look like our friends downstairs are using this area," he said. "I wonder why." Mara took a few steps to the side and pointed towards the end of one of the wall segments. "There's your answer," she said. "Come on, let's go see." She disappeared around the wall. Luke followed, noticing for the first time a gentle flow of air coming from that direction. And the reason for it was quickly clear. Beyond the wall, at the far side of the room, the black stone had been gashed open to the sky. "Collateral damage from the battle that knocked down that tower, I'll bet," Mara said, already crossing to the gash. "Be careful," Luke warned her, hurrying to catch up. Yeah, Mara said. She reached the gash and cautiously looked out. "I was right," she said, pointing. "There it is, or what's left of it." Luke reached her side and looked out. They were looking across a vast circular rooftop that slanted downward from their position at a reasonably steep angle. The stub of Mera's ruined tower was ahead of them and slightly to the left, 80 meters or so away. The distance in dim sunlight made it hard to tell for sure, but to Luke's eye, the jagged edge looked slightly melted. "And you say this stone absorbs turbolaser fire," he said. "Like a very dry sponge," Mera agreed grimly. "Whoever the builders of this place were, they must have had some impressive enemies." "Let's hope they were satisfied with wrecking that one tower and then went away," Luke said, giving the rest of the rooftop a quick but careful examination. Symmetrically placed on the right side of the slanting rooftop was another tower, this one undamaged, stretching a good 90 meters into the sky and topped with a ring of ominous-looking protrusions. Weapon systems, undoubtedly. At the far end of the roof, almost 200 meters from where he and Mera stood, he could see twin bumps that seemed to extend outward from the roof and then continue down the wall on that side. Twin guard houses, possibly, flanking the main entrance. Beyond the roof, he could see a smooth surface stretching through the craggy mountaintop away from the fortress that could only be an access road. In the center of the fortress was a 30-meter-long structure whose flat-topped roof extended horizontally out from the main rooftop, making the whole thing look rather like a round-cornered wedge that had been stuck on as an afterthought. "There's a landing pad on top," Mera said, pointing to the structure. "You can just make out the markings." Luke nodded. The markings were dim, but visible enough when you knew to look for them. "They probably have lights they can turn on when something friendly is on its way in." "With turbolasers ready at the top of that tower in case they're not so friendly." Easing through the gap in the wall, Mera took a few steps out onto the rooftop, peering towards the landing pad. "Looks like the area under the pad is open in front," she reported. "Probably their hangar. Might be a handy place to make for if we ever get caught too far away from our exit." She turned back around, and her breath caught, a surge of surprise shooting through her. "Whoa," she said, her eyes tracking upward. "Come and take a look at this." Maneuvering through the crack, Luke crossed to her side and turned around. Rising from atop the room they'd just been in was yet another tower, and it had friends. Spaced around the curve of the fortress rooftop to the left were three more, all of the same design. Even with Luke's skewed perspective, he could tell that these four rear towers were both thicker and a good 20 meters taller than the single one standing below them. And as with the one below, each of these was also crowned by a ring of weapons emplacements. "This must have been one impressive place in its heyday," Mera commented. Her voice was steady, but Luke could tell that she was feeling the same vague uneasiness that he was. "Like the one on Hijarna. I wish to blazes I knew what they were built to protect." "Or to defend against," Luke added, taking one last look around the rooftop. No lights, no movement, no signs of life at all. "Let's get back inside and find the way down." The way down was on the far side of one of the other wall segments, a smaller version of the spiral slideway they'd used in the barrack section down below. Unlike that one, though, the slideway here wasn't moving. "Either damaged or shut down for lack of use," Mera said, easing a cautious eye over the edge. "Next level down doesn't look inhabited either." "This whole section is probably out of use," Luke said as they started down. "The way the roof slopes towards the broken tower, each of the levels ought to have a little more floor space as we go down. They probably set up shop on the larger levels." "Makes sense," Mera agreed. "Let's keep going until we reach a floor with a working slideway anywhere on it. That should be either their highest working level or close to it." The floors did indeed extend farther outward as they continued down, with the pattern of random wall segments changing with each level. It wasn't until the fourth level that Luke finally caught the faint hum of working machinery. "I think we're here," he murmured, shifting his grip on his lightsaber and stretching out with the force. There still didn't seem to be anyone nearby. "Looks like it," Mera agreed, cupping a hand around one ear. "That sounds like one of the slideways. Shall we take a look?" Luke nodded. "I'll go first. You stay behind me." He headed out, moving as silently as he could across the empty space, trying to ignore Mera's annoyance from behind him. She could call it overprotectiveness if she wanted. and she undoubtedly was calling it exactly that. But after watching her do 5 days in a healing trance, he much preferred to err on the side of caution. He reached one of the rare, at least on this level, wall segments and eased an eye around it. Beyond it, set right up against the far wall, was the spiral slideway they had heard. "All right," Luke murmured over his shoulder. "Real easy now." He sensed Mira's emotional call, but it wasn't coming from directly behind him. He glanced around, feeling a flash of annoyance of his own as he spotted her standing at the corner of one of the other wall segments 20 meters off to his left. She beckoned to him, a quick, impatient gesture, and there was a sudden sense of dread in her emotions. He made it to her side in less than 10 seconds. "What is it?" he hissed. She nodded towards the wall, a silent churning in her eyes and mind. "Around there," she said. Lightsaber ready in his hand, Luke slid around the end of the wall segment. Beyond it was a large open space that had been set up as a sort of command center, though it was currently as unoccupied as everywhere else they'd been today. Two circles of command consoles had been laid out, the boards and displays winking status lights towards the empty chairs in front of them. To one side, a larger and more elaborate chair, ringed by its own status boards, had been set up on a meter-high platform where it could overlook the entire operation. And in the center of it all was a sight that sent a shiver of memory along Luke's spine. A holographic map of the galaxy, with the sectors of the New Republic, the Empire, and the rest of the known regions marked out in the bewildering array of a dozen different colors. The whole variegated mosaic stretched across perhaps a quarter of the huge spiral, fading into neutral white where the edges of the Outer Rim territories gave way to the vastness of the unknown regions beyond. It was a duplicate of the galactic hollow Emperor Palpatine had had in his throne room in Mount Tantus. Luke swallowed, tearing his eyes away from the hollow to give the surrounding equipment a closer look. Yes, the consoles were indeed Imperial issue. Status and computer access boards from a Star Destroyer or other major capital ship. The chairs, likewise, were straight from a Star Destroyer's bridge crew pits, and the Overseer chair and boards were those of an Imperial fleet admiral, such as the one Grand Admiral Thrawn would have used. He felt the whisper of air as Mara came up close behind him. "I think we found our link to the Imperials," he told her. "It looks like even Palpatine may have had a hand in this place." Her hair swished against his shoulder as she shook her head. "You're missing the point, Luke," she muttered. "Look at that hollow. I mean, really look at it." Luke frowned, focusing on the galactic spiral again. What in space was she referring to? And then abruptly he caught his breath. No. No, he was seeing things. Surely he was seeing things. But he wasn't. At the edge of the known galaxy, where Palpatine's hollow had shown only the white stars of the unknown regions, an entirely new area had been colored in. A huge new area. "Funny, isn't it?" Mara said, the dread still swirling through her. "He was exiled from the Imperial court, you know. Just summarily thrown out." "Who was?" Luke asked. "Grand Admiral Thrawn," she said. "Picked the wrong side in one of the political battles that were always going on there and lost. Everyone else in the Cabal wound up demoted or imprisoned, or else reassigned to a semi-private torture chamber, like garrison duty in the Outer Rim. But not Thrawn. Oh no. Even the Outer Rim was too good for this ungrateful alien who'd been accepted into Imperial society and paid them back for their kindness with a slap in the face. No, they had come up with something very special for him. And that something was exile to the unknown regions?" Mara nodded. "If the Outer Rim was a torture cell, the unknown regions was a fully populated Rancor pit," she said. "So with some prodding, and probably a lot of deal-making, they got Palpatine to put him aboard a Star Destroyer and send him on a one-way trip past the Outer Rim." She snorted out a derisive laugh. "And just to add insult to injury, they managed to make it a mapping expedition. Imagine, one of the best strategists the Empire had ever known being reduced to mapping duty, ruining his life and his reputation with a single stroke. I'll bet they were chuckling together about it for years afterward." Luke shook his head. "I seem to be missing the joke." "So did they," Mara said, her dark mood darkening even further. The joke is that it apparently never occurred to any of them that Palpatine was always one step ahead of whatever was happening in his court, and if he was a step ahead, a strategist like Thrawn was at least 2 steps ahead. Luke's mouth felt dry. Are you saying that Thrawn and Palpatine had the whole thing planned out from the beginning? Of course they did, Mira gestured at the hollow. Just look at all the territory he opened up. He couldn't possibly have done that by himself, with just a single Star Destroyer. Palpatine must have been feeding him men and ships all along the way. But that can't be Imperial territory, Luke said. I mean, it can't. Why not? Mira countered. Oh, I agree, there probably aren't more than a few actual colonies out there. But you can bet there are Imperial garrisons scattered all over the place, plus intel centers and listening posts and probably a full-blown shipyard. And if I know Thrawn, probably a whole network of alliances with the natives, too. But if that's Imperial territory, why hasn't the Empire made any use of it? Luke argued. I've seen the data, Mira. They're down to practically nothing over there. It's obvious, isn't it? She said quietly. They're not using it because they don't know it's there. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. Luke gazed at the hollows, listening to the distant hum of the spiral slideway, the terrible implications of these gently glowing lights tumbling over each other in his mind. There had to be the equivalent of 250 sectors there, nearly 30 times the Empire's current size. With 30 times the Empire's number of warships, garrisons, and shipyards? Very possibly. If all those resources were suddenly put at Bastion's disposal. We need more information, he said, starting towards the console rings. Let's see if there's a computer jack R2 can plug into. Risky, Mara warned. This is a command center, and command centers always have security flags set up to catch unauthorized access. He stopped, grimacing. Unfortunately, she had a point. All right then, he said, turning again to face her. What's your plan? We go directly to the source. Mara took a deep breath. I go downstairs and talk to them. Luke felt his mouth drop open. And you call my plans risky? You have a better suggestion? That's beside the point, he growled. Anyway, if someone's going to go down there, it ought to be me. Not a chance, Mara said firmly. Point 1. They shot at you on the way in, but they didn't shoot at me. Point 2. You said yourself you had the feeling they wanted to see me. Point 3. If the situation degenerates to the point where a rescue is called for, you and your Jedi skills are better against a crowd than mine. And point 4. With a tight smile, she unhooked her lightsaber and stepped over to him. Point 4 is that they may not know the extent of my force skills, she said, handing him the weapon. If shove comes to shake, that may give me the edge I'd need. Luke fingered her lightsaber, feeling the familiar coolness in his hand. His own first lightsaber, the one Obi-Wan had given him, which he had given to her in turn on the palace rooftop at Coruscant. He'd been younger than she was when he'd first taken that lightsaber into danger. Younger, less experienced, and far brasher. But still. And the last thing I need right now is for you to start getting all overprotective, Mara added, just the hint of a warning glare in her eyes. I've survived just fine all these years. I can take care of myself. Luke locked eyes with her. Odd, he thought, that he'd forgotten just how brilliant a green those eyes were. Though perhaps it was just the lighting. No way I can talk you out of it? He asked, trying one last time. Not unless you could come up with a better plan, she said, pulling out her comlink and sleeve blaster. Here, there's no point in my keeping these. They'll just take them away from me anyway. I'll keep my blast tech. They'd be suspicious if I came in completely unarmed. Luke took the comlink and sleeve blaster from her, his hand lingering on hers before she withdrew it, oddly unwilling to let go. I wish we hadn't left the other comlink with R2, he said. You could have kept this one, and I'd have been able to listen to what was going on in there. If something goes sour, you might need to whistle up the Quam Jaw in a hurry, she reminded him. Anyway, can't you follow me with the Force? I can follow your presence, Luke said. I can get your emotions and probably some images that way, but I can't get much in the way of words. Too bad you're not a Palpatine, Mara commented, busying herself with removing her sleeve holster. I could talk to him just fine. Luke felt a stab of guilt and shame, her earlier indictment of his dark side dabbling flooding back. She caught the emotion, or else the expression on his face, and smiled tightly. Hey, I was kidding, she assured him, handing him the sleeve holster. Look, you just follow what you can. I'll give you a full report on the details when I get back. All right, Luke said. Be careful, okay? To his surprise, she reached out and took his hand. I'll be fine, she told him, squeezing his hand briefly before letting go. See you. And with that, she was gone, slipping out of the command center and around the wall towards the slideway. With a sigh, Luke stepped over to the nearby wall segment and sank down into a crouch with his back pressed against it. Closing his eyes for better concentration, he stretched out with the Force. In times past, on Dagobah and Tirfan and other places, he'd been able to use the Force to obtain glimpses of future places and events. Now, as Mara headed down the slideway, he tried to focus that same ability onto real-time observation, hoping to be able to see what was happening to her. It worked too, at least after a fashion. The image he got of Mara and her surroundings was faint and foggy, heavily colored by her emotions and shifting mental state, and with the same discomforting tendency to ripple or metamorphose that seemed to be characteristic of Jedi visions in general. But with Mara's mind there to act as an anchor, he was able to quickly drag the images back to something at least vaguely understandable. It was hardly ideal, but it seemed clear that it was all he was going to get. The slideway from this level seemed to be roughly the same size as the one that he had used to get down from the roof. Mara moved to the intersection and headed down, apparently making no attempt at concealment. The lack of any sudden combat twinges in her emotions as she reached the next level implied that she didn't see anyone, though he had the impression that she was still hearing distant sounds. She made no move to get off at this level, but let the slideway carry her on down. The next level was more of the same, with no one coming near the slideway. Luke could sense a definite annoyance beginning to seep through the alertness in Mara's mind, an annoyance aimed both at the aliens' seeming disinterest in her and at their incompetence at basic internal security. She passed that level, and the next, and started down towards the next. And suddenly there was a dizzying jolt that slammed like a groundquake through her emotions, accompanied by a brief flash of pain. Luke stiffened, eyes jerking open as he scrambled to his feet. But even as he did so, he felt a warning flicker of reassurance from her, together with understanding of what had just happened. Without warning, the slideway section she'd been riding on had suddenly reversed direction, yanking her feet out from under her and slamming her flat on her chest on the ramp. And as the moment of dizziness from the impact faded away, her combat emotions flared to full alertness. She was no longer alone. Luke clenched his hands into helpless fists as he rode her emotions to try to pierce the hazy image. There were several people standing around her, of the same species as those they'd tangled with once already, and as near as he could tell through the wavering view, one of them was calling Mara by name. For a moment he continued to talk to her, and though Luke couldn't hear any of the words, he had the impression that he was asking her to accompany them farther into the fortress. She agreed. There was a flicker of inevitability as they took her blast tech, and then the whole group was walking away from the slideway down a corridor that Mara recognized as decorated similarly to the barracks area they'd seen farther below. Soon, all too soon, the group reached an open door. Another exchange of unheard words, a suppressed flutter of uneasiness from Mara, and she stepped alone through the door into the room beyond. From her thoughts, he could tell that there were others waiting inside for her. One of them, possibly more than one, called out to her as she moved farther inside. Mara answered, surges and flickers of emotion marking bits of information that the vagueness of their contact prevented Luke from getting himself. She continued to walk farther into the room, and without warning, right in the middle of a step, the touch of her mind cut abruptly off, leaving Luke staring at the quiet lights of the command center. Heart pounding in his chest, he stretched out with the Force, trying to re-establish the contact. Mara? Mara! But it was no use. There was no response, no returning contact, no sense of her presence. Nothing at all. She was gone. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.